In this lecture, we are going to return to this idea of joint controllership, where we can have two or more controllers who are jointly determining the purpose and means of the processing of personal data. So we will define what a joint controller is. We will look at what a converging decision is. We will look at the fashion ID case, which will provide a useful example of what this actually looks like in action. And then again, for those of you that like clear, structured, bright lines or bullet lists that help us to determine something, I've put together a determination methodology to help you determine whether or not this is a joint controllership situation. And finally, we have some best practices. So, joint controllership is when we have two or more entities that jointly determine the purposes and means of processing. Now, there are two types of decisions that you need to remember. There's a common decision and a converging decision. I know it's a little confusing because they both start with C and they're both decisions and they both have to do with joint controllership. But you need to remember how to separate these out. A common decision is made together by the controllers. So we have two organizations that come together and say, hey, let's work together. The other type of decision, a converging decision, we're going to look at in just a little bit, but essentially a converging decision is when there are common processing activities, the decisions for which are made separately and independently. So a common decision is made in common. A converging decision is really where decisions are colliding together. But anyway, we will look at that in a moment. As with sole controllership, what is most important is the factual responsibility for processing. Again, who is actually determining the purpose and means of processing? This is determined using the same elements that we've already looked at. Who determines the purposes and means? All right, so here's the converging decision. This is where we have two or more controllers, and they are making separate, independent decisions. And those decisions are complementary, necessary for the outcome that is achieved, and inextricably linked. And so if you were to disaggregate those two decisions, then the data would not be processed in the same way, okay? The processing could not occur as it does without the participation of both parties. Decisions together for this converging decision have a tangible impact on determining the purposes and means. And this also results in joint controllership. So you can have a common decision that results in joint controllership. You can also have a converging decision, all right? And so this is referred to as types of participation in our determination methodology, which we're going to look at in a little bit. And so here's a real life example. This comes from the infamous fashion ID case, and it gives us an example of what joint controller looks like in the real world. So the scenario is we have a retailer, this is controller one, who integrated a social media like button onto their website. Controller two is the social media platform. So again, controller one, our retailer, they embedded a plugin into their website to enhance the user experience and to track visitor behavior for analytics and marketing purposes. Controller two, this is our social media platform, they determine how the plugin collects and processes visitor data for their own advertising and profiling purposes. So the retailer sought to optimize the publicity of its products, but did not collect and process the data collected by the plugin. Here we have an example of a converging decision. Both the retailer and the social media platform are making independent but complementary decisions about the purposes and means of the data being collected. The retailer embedded the plugin. The platform, the social media platform, they determined how the data was collected and used. The data processing would not have occurred in this exact way had it not been for both parties' participation. So again, this is an example of a converging decision. Common decision, we have controllers that are intentionally coming together and determining the purpose and means. For converging decision, these are more decisions that are happening in parallel and converge at the point of collection and processing. I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, if you're someone like me, you like to have a nice, neat list of facts or questions that you can go through to determine, yes, this is, no, this isn't. This is a useful slide for you to reference in the future. When determining whether or not joint controllership exists, there are a few different questions here. The 5 criteria you want to think about are purposes and means, factual influence, and we'll define that in a moment, type of participation, decisive influence, and allocation of duties. With regards to purpose and means, the question that you want to ask is, do both parties jointly decide why and how data is processed? For factual influence, do both parties have real, not just formal, influence? For type of participation, is there a common or converging decision on processing? For decisive influence, the question you want to ask is, does each party have decisive impact over the processing? And finally, concerning the allocation of duties, are GDPR duties clearly allocated between parties? So asking and answering these questions will help get you closer toward determining whether or not there is joint controllership. I want to conclude this lecture by looking at some best practices. Again, when trying to determine joint controllership, you might start by identifying the different project stages. What is the data lifecycle? Which stages require joint determinations? You also want to ensure that responsibilities are appropriately identified. And finally, just because 2 or more organizations are sharing infrastructure does not necessarily mean that there is joint controllership. So let's look at 2 scenarios where this might play out. So again, we have a shared platform, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, cloud, whatever. On our shared platform, let's imagine we have 2 actors, an A and a B. So A and B equally contribute user data to the platform. That data is commingled, and A pays B to perform analysis on the data. So A is contributing, B is contributing, and in the end, A says, hey, I want you to take all of this data that we've both contributed, and I want you to perform analysis on it. All right? What do you think? Is that joint controllership? Yes, because they're both collecting data. The data is going into a shared repository, and then A is saying, hey, we've collected this data. How about you perform some analysis on it? And then, further on, perhaps they both benefit from the analysis. So they are jointly determining the purpose and means, at the very least, of that, hey, let's do analysis and see what we get out of this. Scenario 2, on a shared platform, C, again, this is party C, has access only to C's data, and D has access only to D's data. Each, in this case, is an independent controller. That data is not being commingled. C is determining the purpose and means for their data. D is determining the purpose and means for theirs. So in this case, we have independent controllers. Even though the infrastructure is shared, again, think about a data center. Think about, a Google Cloud data center. How many different clients own data on those servers within a single building? Hundreds, thousands, millions, I don't know. But there are a lot, right? They're sharing infrastructure, but that data is siloed, it's partitioned, and each controller is determining the purpose and means for their data. In this lecture, we talked a little bit more about joint controllership. Remember, this is where we have 2 or more entities that jointly determine the purpose and means of processing. You need to know the difference between a common decision and a converging decision. A common decision is when controllers come together and together determine the purpose and means of collection, processing, etc. A converging decision is when we have 2 or more controllers that make separate, independent decisions. However, those decisions are complementary, necessary, and inextricably linked. The processing in this way could not occur as it does without the participation of both parties. The decisions together have a tangible impact on the determination of the purposes and means. This is a converging decision. Your determination methodology at a high level: purpose and means, factual influence, type of participation, decisive influence, and allocation of duties. Remember, type of participation this is determining, is this a converging or a common decision? And finally, for best practices, identify the project stages, which stages require joint determinations, ensure responsibilities are appropriately identified, and remember that shared infrastructure does not necessarily mean joint controllership.